moving up to North Carolina, and our next speaker is actually my counterpart down in North Carolina. But I think he's the coastal engineer. He got his training in Florida, worked in permits, then he came up, saw the light, and joined Sea Grant. And he's the only Sea Grant coastal processing specialist that has been here longer than me. So, and that's a pretty long time. So he does have a lot of experience. And we had him here not only because he's been working in this area, but North Carolina has also just completed a large project where they evaluated 27 different marsh sill projects that they had from a regulatory viewpoint. So once again, they do have a lot of information down there that we don't have. They have very similar conditions in a lot of their embayments. So I'd like to welcome Spencer Rogers, coastal engineer from North Carolina Sea Grant.
How y'all doing? Well, since we've got to be geographically cleared first, I want to announce that I am a Virginian. I was born a Virginian. I'll die a Virginian, but I really like living in North Carolina right now. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've observed over the years on both marsh plantings and on marsh sill projects in particular. And I suggest that if you're looking at erosion control options, you've really only got 5 categories of options to deal with. Avoid the problem being do nothing on some occasions. But we're going to look at the variation between 2 and 3 here, between planting it and living happily ever after and hardening the shoreline and maybe something that verges on a combination of those two. And North Carolina has been doing research on marsh grasses for erosion control for a very long time period. It's been over 50 years that NC State has been looking at the issue. Most of the work was done 30 or 40 years ago, and I think we learned a lot, much of which may not be remembered anymore, but there are some works out there that have described what's going on. And it's not rocket science that if you look at walking along a shoreline that's got a variety of different configurations on it, it became obvious to the people that were working on these marsh grass projects that if you could keep on the order of about 20 feet of marsh grass along a shoreline, then the upland property behind it was almost never eroding. Yet if it got to be too narrow a beach or too narrow a marsh, or if there was a beach behind it, and you've seen pictures of that all along so far, it's those beach areas in the middle where it's not just the shoreline edge is eroding, it's the upland property behind it is eroding. And that's what the property owners are concerned about. So that was the target of the research. And there are a number of good references out there. Scott's got one that's an excellent resource on exposures. But another one is going back to Corps of Engineers work done back in the 1980s by a fellow named Knudsen that looked at the marsh plantings around the U.S. and what exposures were working and what wasn't. And I think the bottom line from most of that work found that if you've got a fetch of less than a mile or so and no boat wakes, then you've got a pretty good chance of just planting some grass and living happily ever after. But if you've got more than a mile of fetch, and certainly by 4 miles of fetch, there's almost no chance of marshes working alone, then you're probably going to have problems with getting it growing. And while you can get aggressive enough with your agricultural practices to maybe grow it in some of these higher exposures, the problem, as you'll see, is that you can't keep it there for very long, and eventually it'll wash away, and you'll have to start over again and drop back farther inland if you're going to have the right water depths. And I guess the major advantages of these marshes, in terms of coastal engineering anyway, is twofold. And one, it's the root mat that, particularly to smooth cordgrass or flora, that root mat is a very tough surface from above. It can take a tremendous amount of pounding by waves. It forces the waves to break and form smaller waves as it's transmitted inland. And the second phenomenon that the marsh grass is good at as erosion control is that just the density of the stems during the summer growing season particularly makes it difficult for a wave to be transmitted through the stems of the grasses. So with sufficient distance, even though the wave doesn't necessarily break, then you're slowing down the wave as it moves through Achilles heel as an erosion control device is that the root mat has a fixed thickness depending on the local tide range and other growth conditions, climate that makes a difference as well. And it's that surface that's the advantage. The higher elevations is working fine, but if you look at the occurrence of erosion at lower tide levels, not at the high tide when the waves are going over top of the marsh as before, but when they're hitting that scarp area in particular as the tide starts to rise, it's the undermining of that root mat that's the real weakness of the marsh and its limit on wave exposure. So that 1 mile fetch distance and boat wave problems all stem from the undermining at lower water levels, not necessarily the storm conditions. And if we start out with the center line here as the original ground elevation, when you start to go out and plant, and you've got a reversal of features. That you've still got erosion going on that was happening before, lower in the intertidal area, below mid-tide. Yet if you get the agriculture clicking up in here, you can build that root mat with smooth boardgrass in particular, and you can raise the elevation from mid-tide elevation up towards mean high water elevation just by the root mat that plant forms. But you've still got this disconnect down here that sooner or later that's going to be a problem for initiating erosion of the marsh itself. And when we started getting interested in these structures, there were already structures in use and in place up in the Chesapeake Bay and in Delaware that we were aware of and had seen some of and liked the idea. But we started looking around North Carolina, and I think if you look around anywhere, you'll see the same thing. There are lots of different accidental structures that are out there that are performing as marsh sill structures, where you've got a combination of a marsh tied to some small structure, often failures for some other purpose. And they're functioning quite efficiently and have been for a long time. This is one of our older ones in North Carolina. It's on the island of Ocracoke. It's got a 40-mile fetch of open water in Pamlico Sound, so there's lots and lots of wave exposure. But in 1962, the Ash Wednesday storm, which also affected this area, beat the heck out of the backside of Ocracoke Village, and the locals went in and got a lot of sackcrete because it's a ferry access only island. You've got to kind of haul everything in to get there. So they had sackcrete that they were able to get after the storm, and they built these small walls out of sackcrete. And the idea was to come in later and fill them with sand so it would be a revetment along the shoreline. Unfortunately, they ran out of money, and what we ended up with was a functional sill that's been in place since 1962 with a fetch of over 40 miles of open water. So there were lots of other structures like this that piqued our interest and made us realize that there was a pretty good chance these things would work well in North Carolina. Now, we've got one problem in North Carolina in particular, and that the regulatory agencies think anything that sits on public bottom below mean high water is sacred territory. And allowing a structure to sit below mean high water is like selling your sister or something. It's beyond imagination in terms of North Carolina. So we were forced to look at other structures that might have a smaller footprint in order to get a permit to begin with to consider these marsh sill projects. And I stumbled on this project up on the Pamlico River. It's an Episcopal church camp, and you can see from the scarp on the right that it had an erosion rate on the order of about 6 inches to a foot every year over time. It was cutting in a pretty steep bank. Well, they saw fit to go in and build this little structure on the left as a bulkhead. And that's when the Episcopal Church learned that even God needs a state permit in North Carolina. They got caught before they could backfill it. It was out in open water, and you can't get a permit to build a bulkhead that far out. So they negotiated some openings in the wall and said, we'll call it a breakwater instead of a bulkhead, and then just walked away. Now, nature didn't let them just walk away. Then all of the grass that you see growing in this area is volunteered on its notice the opening here. That's a box opening. There's a little barrier in front of it and a gap between it, so there's some water circulation in and out of that open water behind it. But this area has a fetch of about 3 or 4 miles at worst case conditions, and the elevation of the wall was extremely low, unusually low for anything we build with bulkheads. But it was a learning experience because in part you could sit in a storm and watch the waves break over top of this thing and see the water level rise behind this solid wall. All of that water flows out through those single gaps between the wall, and what happened along the way is what was 3 feet of water depth scoured to about 6 feet of water depth at those gaps. So it made the point that we need to manage the breaking waves behind these structures if we're going to successfully put in small structures on this kind of scale. Well, this lasted for 9 years, and then the church sold the camp to private developers. They turned the camp buildings into houses and subdivided the rest for real estate, single-family homes. And if we look at the new owners' observation of what the erosion problem was, their immediate reaction was to remove the breakwater. This is 9 months after the breakwater was removed. Everything that had been developed and had grown in that time period was gone. We look at 2 years after the removal, that's what the shoreline looked like. Now, these owners didn't know what that thing was out there. They wanted a better view, so they cut the vegetation and figured they'd pull it out. They didn't really want to build bulkheads at the time, as long as their shoreline was managed. But in this case, once the small breakwater was removed, they were all forced to build bulkheads in order to keep the buildings from being threatened. Now, my first reaction was tears, 9 years down the tubes. But then it became apparent that, well, this really was a test that I couldn't ever do on my own. I would never be able to remove somebody else's erosion control structure and see what would happen. And they were dumb enough to do it, so we should learn something from it. And the point is that this is clearly an exposure where we had a healthy marsh develop, and because of the exposure, once the structure was removed, that the marsh was not stable. And the only way that we're going to successfully get marshes established to work in combination with a small structure that's going to stabilize the toe and the root mat of these structures. And with it, we clearly had a long-term success. Without it, we're going to have problems with the wave exposure. What we came up with as a specific design based on these experiences, and one that we could get a permit for, is a relatively lightweight vertical wall. It looks a lot like a bulkhead, except it's pointed in the opposite direction. In our case, we were able to downsize the materials in sandy soils to 4x4 posts and 2x6 lumber with a 2x6 whaler, so it's really lightweight materials. The cost of these things is about 1/3 to 1/2 the cost of a bulkhead at the same site using the same type of materials. And the other thing we did, based on that scour holes that developed in the earlier example, is that we realized we wanted to spread out the water return along the entire length of the structure. So rather than being watertight like a bulkhead, every 6-inch board has a 1-inch gap beside it. So it's 6 inches solid and 1 inch open, more or less, over the length of the structure. And all these are jetted 8 feet into the ground with no more than 3 feet exposed. Now, in order to have a freestanding structure in the wave field, you got to be really careful because that's a lot of wave force on a relatively lightweight structure. And the way we keep these things surviving is, first of all, we limit the water depth we put them in. We don't want to see more than 2.5 feet of water depth. And we keep the crest of these things at no more than 6 inches above mean-high water. And there's a tendency from the contractors and the owners to think higher is better. Bad idea. Higher means just more wave conditions on what works quite well in the marsh, controlling that type of condition, but it means more wave conditions and a stronger structure if we're going to keep them standing. So we want to keep them no more than 6 inches above mean-high water, and we want a lot of gaps in the whole length of the structure. Beyond that, our magic number from looking at Mother Nature on what was controlling erosion on most of our bays and sounds is we're targeting about 20 feet of planted marsh, primarily with smooth cordgrass in that area. And while the upper part of the beach is going to grow some other vegetation, the primary erosion control vegetation is going to be that tough root mat and stem structure of the smooth cordgrass. We'll look at black needle rush in a minute. Small example, in this case, the property owner had a very irregular shoreline. They wanted to stabilize the return wall on this existing bulkhead and had this long beach beside it. Pretty heavy wave exposure from the south. Fetch is about 7 or 8 miles on the backside of Nag's Head in the Outer Banks. And we came in with one of these small wood structures. In this case, they finished construction, and before they could even get it planted, we had a hurricane come over. It shows the inability of these small structures to protect the shoreline behind it. There was significant erosion of the dunes that were behind it in this area, and in fact, they got about 50 feet of retreat. And the other bad news was all that sand that came out of the dunes ended up behind the breakwater, where we didn't want it, because that's the area we wanted to plant. So we had to wait for it to erode before we could come in and plant it in order to effectively control the erosion behind it. But eventually we did that, and it's still eroding at this point in time, and our marsh is getting gradually bigger over time. But to meet the goals of the property owner was not to trap the sand, but just simply to protect the wing wall from being flanked to the existing bulkhead, and it's been successfully doing that for about 15 years. Now, another learning experience on these vertical breakwaters or sills was from up in Currituck Sound, which is the very northern end near the Virginia line. It's a very freshwater area. Salinity is practically zero all year. Non-tidal, it's subject to wind tides, stays wet all summer and dry all winter when the northeasters are blowing. But before we got involved in the project, there was a negotiation between the property owner and the permit folks, and they said, you got to have a lot of openings. So they took one of these walls and deleted every third board. So like a bulkhead, 3 boards in a row, every third board was missing. So it's 2/3 solid, 1/3 open. The problem with that, and as shown in the open water in this picture, that the wave transmission through something that's 2/3 solid and only 1/3 open is about 99%. So we want these openings maximized because it reduces cost and it handles the return flow better than funneling it into some hole or in. But we know from this particular structure that 1/3 opening is way too big to be successful. And the problem in this particular case is while the ground elevations when this was constructed were ideal to plant the marsh, by the time the structure was installed and they came back to plant it, the water depth was below the planting range of the species that work best in this area. And in this case, it's black needle rush or juncus. It's a fresher water plant. It grows higher in the water column, but is ideal in these low salinity areas. The downside is it's not quite as good a root mat builder, and more of a problem is it's very slow to get established. With smooth cordgrass, you can get things going quite well in a couple growing seasons and start to have a good root mat. With black needle rush, it's going to take 4 or 5 years to really get a good dense stand, and it's probably going to take some replantings along the way as more plants get washed out. One of the issues that came up in the survey before this meeting was what these do in storms, and this is the other section of that same, looking at it from the opposite direction, black needle rush in place and some higher grasses on the right-hand side. And this has been there for about 30 years under these circumstances. The question came up in the survey was, well, what happens in the big storms? And, well, think about it. You've got something in the marsh that starts at mean-high water at the root mat, and it has a 1 or 2 foot stem on it. If it gets to be 5 or 10 feet deep, what do you expect it to do? Not much. So in extreme storm events, this is not what's going to protect the shoreline from erosion. What this will do is, on the routine long-term erosion problems that many of these shorelines face, is going to handle those types of conditions and the annual storms and the 5-year storms. When you get a a bigger storm event, it's going to go over top of it, and other things are going to happen that are more likely to be temporary changes in big storm events rather than long-term losses. And this is after Hurricane Irene last year. You can see that the needle rush is still in place and quite dense. It was the plants behind it that don't benefit from the tough root mat that were washed out in this particular case. And that'll grow back on its own in the next year or so. And the good news is it took out some of the sand, so we're going to have a wider area for the black needle rush to plant than we had before. Now, we've also worked with stone structures as well. The benefits of the wooden structures are that they're relatively inexpensive and easy to install in the right sandy soil conditions. The downside is they don't last as long. The lumber is probably going to last for the 20 or 30-year time range. It's pretty typical for CCA treated lumber. And the other downside for this area is it's not particularly good in tidal areas with ice, because the ice can get underneath the whalers and the beams and lift the structures because they're fairly shallow in the ground. Those are things that you can overcome, but you're going to just have to spend more money to get it deeper in the ground and more stable over time. If we take a look at this particular site, it's on the Cape Fear River in the southern part of the state. It's an estuarine river about 30 miles long up to the state port of Wilmington. It's got a channel depth for the port of over 46 feet, and the major problem here is we've got ship wings, not outboards, but 400-foot ships. And when they come through, they have a long period swell. It's pretty devastating on the shorelines along much of the riverfront. This was a very small structure. It's some of the smallest stone we've ever seen used. I didn't pick the stone size. A private engineer did, but it's the very low end of the scale. There's very little heavier than 50 pounds out there, but remarkably, it's done quite well. This is after the first growing season, and the back edge of the property is still eroding right over top of the structure. So this is a case where neither of the structure or the marsh is going to be successful alone. Their benefit is that they're going to work together. And we've seen this time and time again. The erosion continues until we're successfully getting the marsh established. After the second growing season, things got a whole lot better. And it's been quite effective since then, once that marsh got in there. Take a look at the other side. Again, very small structure. Crest is about knee-high water. After the third growing season, looks pretty much like that. And at high tide, when the ship wakes come through, that's the surge that it gets. That's a pretty significant surge coming through. And it survives even with small stone. Well, in order to get, we've got an easy permit now for the wooden marsh sills. North Carolina believes that if you're going to permit something, you ought to permit it quick and get it out of the way and let the property owner go about their business. So we got a quick permit for the wooden sills. The stone sills, because they've got that footprint problem on public bottom that we can't avoid, have been much slower to get organized. We've gone through several general permit iterations to try to make it easier, but it's still a bloody mess. And one of the things we did was to try to bring in a group of the biological researchers in the state from all the university systems and look at this as a multi-beneficial structure with the marsh. And being the dumb engineer, my presumption would be that everybody would recognize this as unavoidable benefits of the habitat that was created by these marshes behind it. So after we got 30 mostly biologists in the room with me, the engineer geologist, trying to keep them honest with the physical processes, we came up with this report. And this is pretty simple to summarize, because what we found out was that my critter is best. Seems to be that from the biological perspective, if your critter likes the habitat that's created, if you like alterniflora and smooth cordgrass, then these things are great structures to permit. However, if you like benthic bottom critters and you're replacing benthic bottom with marsh or rock, then, oh, these are terrible. You can't possibly permit these things. okay to some extent, but, you know, is that really what we want? And in many cases with benthic bottom particularly, it means we can force bulkheads or revetments on higher ground and build them on upper parts of the shoreline. But as you've seen in pictures before, with an eroding shoreline, sooner or later, that's going to end up being the shoreline, and everybody's going to be losing habitat in the end. So this really wasn't a good solution. And we looked for other ways that may be useful in other places. And clearly from all those erosion options at the top 5, there are always trade-offs in habitats. Even if you do nothing, you're trading upland property for some other environment, whether it's muddy bottom or whether it's a marsh creation. You're always trading something no matter what happens when you're looking at erosion management options. So avoiding trading in habitat is not really an option. It's going to happen. The choice is whether you want to make your own choices or not. And one way to look at that is what's happening to our existing habitats. The Sea Grant funded a study of looking at marsh acreage behind about 10 miles of Barrier Island in the southern part of our state. Clearly we're losing marshes and wetlands in the northern part in our open sound at a very rapid rate, up to 20 feet per year. But that's less obvious when you look at the southern part of the coast. So by comparing aerial photography over time, what they found, the green is the marsh area, and this red is the marsh loss. And we look at the marsh accretion, so we've got a net coming and going. And the bottom line is over the last 49 years, 18% losses in the marsh area. So if we're looking at trading habitats, it makes sense from a regulatory perspective, is we ought to be trading towards the one that we're losing. So in this case, it's a good justification for looking at marsh sills as an option. Now, another problem with these is that you really need a good route map builder. This is in a freshwater area on our sounds, and it's got cattails and some other nice freshwater, but none of those are good route map builders, and the only way this survives is by the structure alone. So it's created a nice habitat for those plants, but it's the structure that's controlling the erosion, not these wetland plants. And we've been experimenting as well with shell bags. If you walk along and look at oyster rocks around the U.S., you're still seeing erosion behind it. So personally, I'm skeptical that these are going to be successful in the long run. But we're taking a close look to see whether that works as well. And then there's this project in Hauppauge. It's the poster child for all bad about marsh sill projects. Warren Pilkey's written a white paper on how bad these things are and pasted that with all marsh sill projects in general, which I think is really unfortunate. But this is clearly not the best of projects. It's grossly over-designed. It's probably 5 or 10 times wider than it needs to be, and at least that much more expensive than it needed to be. My 1962 bag projects are right around the corner from this. If the engineer had paid attention to what was working in nature right next door, this would have been a lot different project. So it doesn't have to be this kind of scale to look at marsh sill projects. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about marsh migration, but that's one that we've clearly got misnomers for. That it takes a very flat slope in order to survive marsh migration. We've got about several thousand square miles where it is an issue, and if your shoreline looks like this one, then don't talk to me about marsh migration